everyone. Welcome to another English Solutions for Business and Life video. Today, we will be looking at the Global Intermediate book, Unit 5, and the grammar section. In this grammar section, we will look at 4 different parts or topics. The first one will be the modals of obligation and permission. We will look at what these modals or modal verbs are and when to use them. We will also look at past modals of obligation. We will look at present, perfect, simple, and continuous, for and since. And lastly, we will look at separable phrasal verbs. So let's begin. First, let's look at modals of obligation and permission. We use the modal verbs must and have to talk about obligation. For example, you must obey these laws. That's an obligation. They have to wear gloves to work. That's another obligation. We use not have to say that something isn't necessary. For example, you don't have to come to work tomorrow. That means that it's not necessary, you can stay at home. We use mustn't or must not to talk about prohibition. That means something that is not allowed. As you can see before these negative forms, must and have to talk about obligations, something that you have to do, you must do, that you're obliged to do. But not have to, here we're lowering the strength of these obligations, meaning that it's not necessary to do something. But in the case of mustn't, the negative form of must is a prohibition. You cannot do something. Now we use need to and needn't the same way we use have to and not have to. Alright, so let's make this a little bit smaller now, because we're going to talk more about another part of this topic. We already talked about modals of obligation. Now let's talk about modals of permission. The modals of permission are can, may, and be allowed to. You can also use the negative forms cannot, may not, or be not allowed to. Obviously, you would have to conjugate the verb to be in this modal of permission. We use them to talk about permission. For example, you can't leave work early today. You don't have permission to do it. You may go now. You have permission to go. We aren't allowed to use the lift today, meaning that, we don't have permission to use the lift or the elevator. Now, all of these modals, you have to remember to use to correctly. You must use the infinitive without to after modal verbs such as must, can, may, and another one that we didn't see, could. You must use the infinitive without to. For example, I must speak with her. You don't use to here. That's incorrect. I must speak with her. Alright, now let's look at the next part, past modals of obligation. Past modals of obligation, for example, had to. Had to, we use had to talk about an obligation in the past. And had to is the past form of have to and must. So, have to and must, if we used have to or must in the present, we would use had to in the past. For example, I had to work late last night. That was an obligation in the past. Now, the negative form of had to, didn't have to, would be used to talk about a lack of obligation in the past, meaning that you didn't have an obligation, you didn't have to do something in the past. Well, I already said it. Now, let's look at an example. I didn't have to get up early this morning. That means that I could get up late. I didn't have the obligation to get up early. Now, let's look at another part. This is permission. Was or were allowed to and could, or was not allowed to, were not allowed to, or could not. We use them to talk about permission in the past. For example, I could use my laptop in the play, meaning that I had permission to use it, but, for example, I wasn't allowed to use my phone, would be that you don't have permission to do something. Now, let's look at present perfect simple and continuous and the words for and since when we use them with these forms, with these tenses. Let's start with the present perfect continuous. We use the present perfect continuous to describe an action that happened in the past and still continues now when we want to emphasize how long it has happened for. On the other hand, we use the present perfect simple when we talked about an action that happened recently and is relevant still now, but it has to finish. We talk about finished actions which happened recently. For example, in the case of the present perfect continuous, we could say I've been teaching here for 10 years. In the case of the present perfect simple, we could say I've taught here for 10 years. Now, most of the time they can be used, both of these tenses, in the same way, with very little difference in the meaning. I've taught here for 10 years and I've been teaching here for 10 years has a very similar meaning, so there's not much difference between these two. Now, in the case of state verbs, we would prefer to use the present perfect simple. We wouldn't say she's always been loving him. We would say she's always loved him. That's the present perfect simple. Now, we also often use expressions such as for and since with the present perfect simple and present perfect continuous to talk about unfinished actions or states. The difference is that we use for a period of time and since for a point in time. For example, we use for in this sentence, I've been learning Spanish for 5 years. I've been learning Spanish for 5 years. We're talking about a period of time. In this case, it's 5 years. I've worked here since 2008. I've worked here since 2008. Here we use since, and we're talking, we say 2008, so that's a point in time. We started then, and we still haven't finished the action of working. We continue working, even today. So those are the present perfect simple and continuous and the words for and since. Lastly, let's look at separable phrasal verbs. A phrasal verb, as you may know, is a two-word verb consisting of a verb and a particle. It could be an adverb, it could be an preposition. For example, there are a couple of phrasal verbs that we have already seen. Tidy up, try on, bring up, keep up, look up, put on, take up, and tell off. Most phrasal verbs can be separated That means that the verb and the particle can be separated by an object. These are some common separable phrasal verbs. Now, to separate them, there has to be a particle, a particle that separates them. This object can be a pronoun. If it's a pronoun, it would go between the verb and the particle. For example, the pronoun it would go between tidy and up. It, tidy it up. And that could apply with many different phrasal verbs. For example, try on, bring it up, keep it up, look it up, put it on, take it up, and so on. Now, when the object is a noun, it can go after the verb and the particle or between the verb and the particle, like it. We could say tidy. Let me just move this a little bit over here because the noun is longer than the word it. Instead of it could be that mess. Tidy that mess up. Now, as I said, it could go between the verb and the particle or after the verb and the particle, such as tidy up that mess. And that applies for practically all of these separable phrasal verbs and some other separable phrasal verbs that you may know. That's it for this video though. I hope you enjoyed it and it has helped you better understand the grammar for this unit. If you have any more questions, don't forget to ask your teacher about them, and we will continue making videos and you may continue learning English with them. Hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time.